Right.
Why have they tried to manipulate us with negativity?
Well, a lot of things happen. First, when you look at the brain itself, when you look at what goes on when you're afraid or fearful or angry, you get very incoherent kind of brain patterns. You're more apt to, move along the flight or fight response rather than, logical, rational sort of reaction to things. Whereas at the slower, where you're more evenly tempered, if you will, or experiencing the positive emotions, love, empathy, compassion, the mind slows, the breathing falls into place, you drop into a lower range in terms of the brain activity, and they're more coherent, rhythmic signals, the kind that lend themselves to better kinds of thinking, more creative kinds of thinking. So when you agitate, you can push people in a direction as opposed to when people are in a better state of making decisions. But, a lot of people, I think, recognize that, for what it is today. Because there's a big reaction. I think this last year we've seen a little bit of that in terms of how people react to the negative aspects of campaigning.
It's backfiring in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's long overdue. And people recognize this. I mean, when I think about political environments, and my family's, been involved in politics in my region, 50 years, and I can tell you that the kinds of things that go on, in front of the public are one thing. What goes on that the public really doesn't get to weigh in on is an entirely different matter. And, at some point, all of this, gets to the point where you go, wait a minute, where is the rational sort of approaches to the government, to our minds, to our brains? I mean, you think of propaganda generally, what happens in an environment of fear and orange alerts and panic kind of mindsets is this incoherent kind of thinking, the kind that does not lend itself ultimately to good government and nor anything else that's positive. And that's sort of the fundamentals of mind control when you get right down to the basics of it.
In the last couple weeks, I've had two guests talk about mind control. One of James Earl Ray and another of Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan Sirhan, one of the assassins of Robert Kennedy. I say one of them because some experts now are convinced that there were a couple shooters. And then, of course, James Earl Ray, who recanted, saying that he didn't do it. Another strange story there, right? Because even the family of Martin Luther King Jr. claims that they don't believe James Earl Ray was the shooter.
Right.
But this talk of mind control to do things, we know the CIA has been involved in it.
Right.
It's a dangerous thing to play with, Nick.
Right. You remember the Unabomber. In the New York Times, actually.
Ted Kaczynski.
Right. He was reported in the New York Times to have been a MK Ultra victim when he was at Harvard. And, I found that pretty startling when I first read it, and I thought about it. Who were the rest of them? Because the literature, their own literature, the investigations of the CIA, the investigations of the FBI and the organizations that were involved in these experiments, acknowledged thousands and thousands of people that were utilized in these experiments, and yet we hear of one or two victims. What happened to the rest of them? What else did they go on and do is another question. And, what condition are they in today? And these are, when you think about, I think it was Secretary of Energy O'Leary was during the Clinton administration said that 500,000 Americans have been used in various kinds of human experiments over about a 40-year period, which included the mind control experiments and some of the other ones that have made notoriety over the years. But none of these, or very few of these, have been compensated, looked at for health consequences of whatever they were involved in this far down the line. And the few that have, it's an embarrassment that we have had this situation occur in the country.
Almost like what the Nazis did during World War II.
Yes, absolutely. Only then, at the end of the war, if you remember, we hung a few people by the neck, for being involved in this kind of nonsense. And, I think there's a time when, and this gets into a lot of the issues that you've covered over the years, and it's this idea of disclosure. At what point do we have to say, wait a minute, this system that has evolved of secrecy and really abuse of power on so many different levels, really should end. And the only way it can possibly end, in my estimation, is a major change in government and significant institutions, whistleblower institutions, if you will, that apply not just to government but to the private sector, and give people a chance, to come forward, acknowledge what they've been involved with. Do it under a model like South Africa did, where people could come forward, acknowledge what they were involved in, be forgiven, and move forward. But if they don't, within a specified amount of time, and somebody comes forward and identifies them, then throw the book at them. But I think we need a chance for really a kind of a cleaning out of the air on a lot of this. And, when you look at these kinds of projects, particularly when we're dealing with the mind and consciousness, I think we need to know the truth.
Nick Begich will be back to talk about the research that led you into the direction of enhancing human brain performance. Later on in the program, we're going to talk about extrasensory perception in the last hour as we're taking calls with Nick Begich. He's here for a full 4, but I do want you to share some of your ESP stories. We'll be back. Full 4-hour program with Nick Begich tonight. Nick, tell us about your research that pushed you in the direction of the human brain and its performance.
Well, if you go back, really, for me, the most exciting things were these sort of anomalous capabilities. When I go back to my even my teen years, I was interested in that. But what was interesting to me is as I aged a little bit and met a lot of different people in the sciences, how many people began their scientific inquiries on the basis of just observations in terms of what the mind might be capable of. And last year in 2007, we had an opportunity to get a few of those folks together, and a couple of them surprised me because they sort of went into this discussion about where we're headed, where we're evolving to, and the idea of opening up these possibilities of the mind and even being able to measure some of these things. And it was surprising. Alexander Kavarainen, who was a biophysicist during the very end of the USSR, for the last 10 years, he was the director for the USSR Academy of Sciences Biophysics Department. And Alex had made an observation. He's in his 60s now, but as a young person, he had made the observation that was taken to one of these shows where they demonstrate all the paranormal back when he was a kid, about 14, 15 years old. And the guy is brilliant. He's probably one of the top 4 or 5 biophysicists on the planet. And he spent his life trying to analyze, sort of what is the root of all of that in terms of the underlying mathematical models that would allow for those kinds of things to happen, whether it was telekinesis or telepathy or apparitions or these kinds of things. And so he's actually published quite a bit on this. It's in English, so you can actually find it on the web. But fascinating material. If you've got a strong physics background, it's even more exciting. It's kind of bridging from the physics to sort of applied technologies is where it goes from there. And that's where I think we're going to see some very exciting things in our lifetimes. But at the same time, we need to be careful about sort of how these technologies might be actually used. The idea of interfaces, direct interfaces with consciousness and the mind are linked to consciousness is what a lot of this technology is heading us towards.
The title of your book, Controlling the Human Mind, but the subtitle is fascinating. The Technologies of Political Control, or Tools for Peak Performance. In essence, you're saying that the mind can be used for distinctively 2 things. One could be for good, peak performance. The other could be used for bad.
Yeah, I think that's true. When we consider sort of the dimension of what you can do, once you learn the mechanisms under which these things operate, how to get super memory, how to get super consciousness in terms of some of these other attributes, how to increase our ability to use the mind that we have, at the same time, the same underlying principles would provide the same knowledge you would need to do the opposite, to degrade people's performance. And so the question, and when you look at this, when I look historically, and in Controlling the Human Mind, we did this. We kind of went back and looked at the history of a lot of these technologies